Hey everyone. So today has been a really remarkable um, day in the life of man. It's early June in 2020, and as we're looking at the world today, and we're specifically looking at the United States, we tend to see a unique expression of people's frustration and anger. About a week ago, George Floyd, an African American man, had been killed in Minneapolis by a police officer. The video was quite clear. And just a day ago, President Trump had stepped into the Rose Garden and declared that while George Floyd's death was a tragedy and we should mourn it, that the protests and the rioting and the looting, right, using words like thugs, calling people domestic terrorists. These are all pretty heavy claims that we have to kind of explore today. And what I want to do is just take a moment as we're getting done with this school year. It's so important to talk about this before we leave. So what I have today is a little exploration. We're going to be taking a look at the current protests, and we're going to start there. And we're going to be taking a look at one city. And we're going to start with my home city-ish, Chicago. I'm originally from Chicago Ridge, a suburb of Chicago, and our suburb has been affected. We've had a curfew. My parents had told me for 9 o'clock. The surrounding areas have had looting of buildings in shops and things like that, broken windows. And so we can see that, right, it's leaving the city centers and really going farther out. Even in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, on Saturday and Sunday, there were hundreds of people at protests and showcasing their support of the Black Lives Matter movement, the support for George Floyd. In that area, it's been pretty peaceful, right? And today we're going to be taking a look at, right, is number one, right? Where are protests going on today? Two, how does the city of Chicago and its history of protests showcase the unique quality of people needing to demonstrate a need for a different reality, right? That's I think a lot of what people are doing. And number three, we're going to try to break down, right? You know, when is the display of anger and the demonstration to change the laws? When is it maybe okay? And when is it one as it starts spiraling into violence, right? Number one, who's doing that? And two, right, is it justified? So let's take a look today. We're going to take a look at some information, and I'm going to share my screen. So we're going to take a look at some sources. So you can see to the map to my left here, right? Here is a map of the current protests that are going on in the last week or so in response to George Floyd's death. And I think it's important to note, right, that this is not just about that one person, right, who was killed in police custody. You know, we're talking about a history here, and it goes back in, before the 1960s, before the civil rights movement, and the kind of continual drag on this, right? And we can't forget that all this is going on in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're trying to understand how things impact one another, right? One of the things that staying inside and trying to worry about the pandemic does, right, is if you think about the backbone of the American people, right? There are nerves that kind of pop up, right? And the more you aggravate the spine, right, the more that you aggravate the frustration, right, the easier it is to hit that nerve. And so we can see here, right, that there are protests in many of the states, the majority of the states, and in many states like Wisconsin and Illinois and California and Texas have basically deployed their National Guard to basically help keep the peace. Now, the National Guard is not the U.S. military per se, right? The National Guard are state units who train with military arms and equipment, but their goal is really different, right? It's to maintain peace. It's not about a sort of a military action or strategy, right? And so we really have to kind of take a look at this and go back, right? Because what we can see first off, right, is the where is really important. Where do we see these riots? And once again, think about this, right? If this was any other time, you wouldn't see anyone wearing any masks at these protests, right? Unless you were a looter or a rioter, right? Because you don't want to be seen. So that's what makes this whole thing difficult, right? That we see images like this of people feeling that these actions against businesses and police, right, are justified, and it becomes a big question that we really need to ask ourselves, right? How do we balance out this need for social change, and how do we do it in a way that's peaceful? And I think it's important to realize that it's not like this happened in a bubble. Of the Colin Kaepernick situation, the kneeling, right, kind of brought out this resentment of what people felt about the movement at all, right? And so I think it's important to note that, when we talk about peaceful protests, right, there were peaceful protests, and those protests were largely ignored. And once again, we have to realize that there's two sides here. There are good, upstanding people protesting and wanting something better, and there are good, upstanding police officers who are trying to do right by their citizens and not cause anger and harm or exacerbate the problem. And then, of course, you have the other sides of both here, and that's really what's tough when we have to try to understand what these protests actually mean, because we're getting kind of lost in the damages, right? If you're on one side, you're getting lost in the damages that the police have done, right? If you're on the other side, you're getting upset the damages that these rioters and looters have done. And that's not it. That's not the place we want to be. And that's the thing, right? Going back to the city of Chicago, right? This for the news story showcases, what happens when it goes beyond the central city, right? People all over many communities are feeling frustrated, and it is exactly then when that frustration can be taken advantage of. And when we talk about the protesters, the rioters, the looters, right, they're not all the same thing. And we have to consider that there are both groups on both sides wanting to make this into something violent, right? Both the far left and the far right. Far left because, right, the constant idea of breaking down a social system they might not agree with. But on the far right, the whole goal is to kind of showcase, well, okay, it's started now, right? So let's exacerbate it and bring us to a point where we know authorities, when they see the violence, are going to have to respond in kind. And, once again, that escalation is where we're at right now, and hopefully will end. So let's take a little adventure, right? This is not just about those people. It is not just about George Floyd. It is a large, major problem in our American society. And to start with that problem, right, let's go back and look at the city of Chicago, right? Now, the city of Milwaukee, too, has seen many protests and some violence, right? The same thing with Madison here. But I think to really understand the history of protests and race relations in the United States, especially since after the Civil War, Chicago is a great example. And the first thing we're going to showcase today, it wasn't really a race riot, but it represented a really important moment in Midwestern Chicago history, right? The Haymarket Affair. Now, the big thing to understand, right, this happened on a rally on May 4th, 1886, right? This had to do with the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. And it's important to realize that, right, many of these individuals were just normal working class American, white folks, essentially, but also, right, immigrants coming over, right, Polish immigrants, German immigrants, Irish immigrants. And, right, this was a fight for equality, right? Equal pay, right? Working 8 hours a day, having conditions they can live with. And that's an important thing, I think, to kind of put this into perspective, right? That what we're seeing with George Floyd isn't just a fight for racial equality. It is a fight for equality of resources and fairness in the justice system, and fairness at work, specifically too. Right, here are the two individuals who put this protest together, right? Lucy and Albert Parsons. And probably the most famous thing we remember from this moment is a picture like this, right? There was a bomb that goes off in the midst of this protest, right? And it started a whole line of rioting and basically the police responding in kind. 7 police officers die during this event. In the bomb itself, 4 protesters die, and more beyond that, right? They actually find these individuals, these labor leaders, and 9 of them are sentenced to death. So this is a history in the city of Chicago that we have to come and recognize, but also in the rest of the United States, right? So we'll fast forward a little bit. Chicago would see, just a few years after the Columbian Exposition, and they would try to fix these things, sweep it under the rug. But if we go to right after World War I, right, you have the Chicago race riot of 1919, right, and extending into. And this has to do, once again, think about the factors involved, right? African Americans are moving up from southern sharecropping locations and lands. World War I has ended, and African Americans, right, as the sort of white working class American gets drafted in the war, right? There's open spots in factories all around Chicago that produced for the war. And what we end up seeing is, the riot itself, and this is a great website, by the way, to take a look at, where we see the riots of Chicago, right? So it was a protest, and there was different sides to this protest. That's kind of the crazy thing, right? And once again, we look at a moment like this 100 years ago and take a look at it through a perspective of race. And the idea here, of course, is that many of these African Americans living in these pockets, right, were being thrown out of their jobs. And essentially what happens is, and you can kind of see down below, right, that there is an ascent, there's a riot, right, and a fight between whites and blacks in the community. And this really does, I think, outline what we're seeing in Chicago today more than ever, right? We're probably not going to see nearly the numbers we have down here, thank goodness, right? But when you have a total of 456 reported deaths, right, and the majority of them being African American, you have a problem in a society, right? You have a sustained inequality that has existed since before the Civil War. And I think that's one thing we have to kind of understand as we're approaching this, right? And it's not that we don't support police officers, and it's not that we don't support those National Guards people, and it's not that we don't want small businesses to succeed and thrive, especially in this terrible time, right? But this is not a situation where we can just say this one side did it, right? And African Americans and whites are essentially fighting in the streets during this process, and that's really, I think, the big thing to consider here. That the world we live in isn't black and white, and you can see, right, in this other image down here, the Chicago Daily News, right. Once again, these images are not new. These are not new things in American history. We are not witnessing something new. We are noticing how the context of our society has changed, but the underlying tensions still exist. And at a moment when the context is bringing those nerves to the top of the skin, right, it's easier to get hit, especially when you have a very well documented case of inequality, right? Action in the Black Belt, some riot pictures, torch, bullet, and hoodlumism. Right, hoodlums, another term utilized. And you got to think about this, right? This is what we call a dog whistle, right? Because when we're talking about this term, generally when we talk about hoodlums or thugs, right, that has a racial overtone. And that's an important thing to consider, right? Not that, young white men can't be thugs, right? But it's not used in that context mostly. It has a very specific context, and how you use a word is just as important as the word being used. And so, right, when we go into the future, right, we see a video here. This brings up another major moment, right? Almost 50 years into the future, right? Kind of this midpoint along the Chicago timeline is the 1968 Democratic National Convention protest, right? And 1968 was a crazy year. It was the year Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy, right? The Americans were roiling in Vietnam. So now we can understand how the context of history can create moments like this, right? that if those events weren't there, you might have had a way more peaceful situation. But as you start piling on historical realities, right, once again, that aggravates the quality of understanding. And many people were super frustrated, not just with Vietnam, but with the continued racial relations in places like Chicago. Now, the 1968 protests have a different context too, but you see a lot of the same sort of ways that at least the police are dealing with this as they do today. Riot gear, right? Mayor Daley at the time, famously said, there's a shoot to kill order out on protesters, which was super scary, right? My parents lived through this event. And I think that's important, right? It was its own storm, and it represented once again this fractured America that we need to talk about, right? And you can see some of the pictures, right? You can, once again, there is rioting, there is looting, there is things on fire, right? And that's that. Once again, this is not new. This is a history that we haven't fixed yet. And that brings us to today, right? As you're looking at the Sun Times, right? You can see, right, police officers arresting someone. They're not protecting themselves for the most part against the disease, right? But that goes across the board, right? There are some people wearing masks, but some people are actively shouting. This is a picture, right? Run with Ahmaud, and Ahmaud Arbery, who recently was also killed, not necessarily by the police directly, right, but by those who felt he was doing something wrong. And you could see the protests, right, and those people being arrested, and the police trying to protect businesses, right? Once again, these, if you were, 300 years from now, you might get a picture like this confused with a picture from 1968, if it wasn't in black and white. And yet, once again, there's these moments too, right, where frustration does boil, but the way we fight that frustration, the way we deal with it is not by fighting, it's by trying to understand. People are angry, right? And police are frustrated too. I'm sure many many folks in law enforcement looking at this and being like, oh geez, I hope this doesn't happen here, right? Because it puts their lives in danger. This doesn't help anyone, right? But I think, once again, if we're trying to end on an image that matters, it's trying to realize that we should be all in this together. This is a moment that we can take a look at and say, whether you are emphatically supporting law enforcement, or you feel that police officers generally do bad things. I think the reality is that there's humanity here, and the humanity here needs to be taken a look at first and foremost, right? Especially, once again, when you can understand the realities of people living in these conditions, right? You go back to 1919, right? This fight for equality and fairness, it hasn't stopped for 100 years, and things have gotten better, but they haven't been fixed. So that brings us to the last thing, I think, which is the concept of looting. What is looting and rioting? What goal does it have? Well, I think the first and most important thing to realize is that protesters they're not rioters, right? Protesters, not all these people are people who are protesting what happened to George Floyd. Several of these people are simply opportunists. They see a situation and they go, bam, all right, time to get me a new watch or a new television. And I think that's kind of one thing to consider. Now, some people, right, I know there's pictures of Target being looted, right, this one up here. I think it's important to realize, too, that there are probably some people who are looting who are like, oh my gosh, I haven't had money in 8 weeks, like I needed food, and well, Target's getting looted, I might as well go myself, right? Now, it's not necessarily like the best motivation, but I think it's important to realize that there is some issues of poverty behind this, maybe not for the hot topic situation, right? And once again, we have to, it's hard to justify violence and stealing, right? And I don't think that we need to stand back here and say, like, this is okay to do. I think we need to stand back and take a look at this and see, like, well, it's not okay to do, but the process of getting here wasn't just oh, protest, right? And these protesters are doing that. Now, once again, there are some protesters who do feel like this is the way out, right? So they do encounter this and say this is the way. But then there's also others, right? I mean, if you do looting, I think it's to realize something very important, though I'm not necessarily giving the greatest images here, that I think the reality here is um, it's not just those individuals who are um, who are interested in the movement, right? There are people who are interested in trying to set this up as a violence thing, us versus them, right? And this is a tactic that's, once again, we can look in the history books and see it's been going on for a long time. Those individuals who want to keep the status quo are and change the status quo so it's more about an issue of race, and how these people are not good, right? And this is exactly why we have the police force that we have, and we need to support them, no matter what. And I think that's just as dangerous. And to realize that groups, white supremacist groups, are involved in this rioting, in this protest. And it's a tactic that's used specifically when we take a look at other protests, right? When you take a look at the Hong Kong protests, right? And I think that's kind of the thing to consider here, right? The Chinese government utilizes their own collaborators and their own instigators in order to create this problem, right? And once again, I think the most important thing to consider is that there's people who would just take the opportunity. They're not for a cause, and they take the opportunity. But that's the point, though, is because of the context of the situation. Because when we take a look at the history of a place like Chicago, and we note that places like Chicago have long histories of these sort of tensions, right? That's what causes this, right? What causes the looting and the rioting isn't people protesting, it's that people protesting are so upset about what's been going on. And in general, law enforcement has made some significant changes, but in some places haven't made changes to the things that people really require. And I think that's the important thing to remember here, right? Whether we're talking about Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, and beyond, right? That peace comes at a cost, and it comes at the cost of changing something that we don't necessarily feel like you should mess with at the moment. But without that peace, without that change, right, we will continue to get instances like what happened to George Floyd. And I think that needs to be understood. And that in that, right, is a long history of protest for fairness and equality. And for the most part, right, while those movements didn't see change right away, they saw change eventually. They saw change down the road, and it created the conversation. So when you are watching videos of protests and looters and rioters and the president speaking about this, right, this is a large issue that we've been dealing with for a long time, but now it is on us as a country to deal with it amongst the other issues that we have to deal with. That's this video. Have a good day.